My name is Robert Sepehr, and I'm an anthropologist. And I know that many of my subscribers share my passion for archaeology, ancient history, and general truth-seeking. That said, my field is not a glamorous one and has been riddled with politics and corruption for many years, with very little resemblance in real life to what one finds on the big screen, such as with Indiana Jones movies. There is an exception, however, where reality seems to be symbolically portrayed during the ending scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which closes out in a giant warehouse where the great archaeological treasures of mankind are stored, locked away, never to be seen again. This giant warehouse of historical relics could possibly represent the underground vaults of the Vatican, which houses a great deal of old forgotten books and ancient artifacts from antiquity, which only a select few have access to. Another institution that comes to mind is the Smithsonian Institute, which many in my field have discreetly accused as being involved in covering up many of the great secrets of Earth history, sealing the door on our imaginations, broadly interpreting the past as devoid of anything unusual or mysterious, as characterized by many of the great cultures of the distant past. While the Bible speaks of giants roaming the earth in the remote past, so do many other mythologies from around the world, as quoted by the Greek poet Homer in 400 BC, saying, "On the earth there once were giants," or as communicated by Native American tribes, who have a long oral tradition passed down concerning inhabitants with an unusually large demeanor. In fact, it was none other than President Abraham Lincoln who was quoted in 1848 as saying before Congress that, quote, "the eyes of that species of extinct giant, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as our eyes do now." What was this giant species Lincoln spoke of? A race many presume to be of a tall, strong, and intellectually sophisticated people. Well, we know that the ancient American landscape was littered with many ancient burial mounds, and while digging, exploring, or legitimate testing in an anthropological context is forbidden these days, this was not always the case. During the last several centuries, the remains of hundreds of giant humans have been discovered on U.S. soil and reported on in a variety of news outlets, back before the media was consolidated into the hands of a few. In a time before mainstream archaeology came to subscribe the general public to its Afrocentric view of prehistory, generations prior to when Darwinian theory was turned into a pseudo-religious cult, the American pioneers and early settlers thought that some of the ancient earthworks were not built by the direct ancestors of modern native people living in the historical period, but rather were constructed in a more remote era, encompassing a different social order. They documented their findings in old diaries and letters, carefully written and compiled into pioneer history books, such as these. Quote, "Mastodonic remains are occasionally unearthed, and from time to time discoveries of the remains of Indian settlements are indicated by the appearance of gigantic skeletons with high cheekbones, powerful jaws, and massive frames peculiar of the red man, who left these as the only record with which to form a clue to the history of past ages." The history of Brown County, Ohio. Evidence for the occupation of this region before the appearance of the red man and the white race is to be found in almost every part of the county, as well as through the northwest generally, in removing the gravel bluffs, which are numerous and deep, for the construction and repair of roads, and in excavating cellars. Hundreds of human skeletons, some of them of giant form, have been found. A citizen of Marion County estimates that there are about as many human skeletons in the knolls of Marion County as there are white inhabitants at present. The history of Marion County, Ohio. During the colonial and post-colonial era, the settlers diligently gathered as much knowledge of the forgotten past as feasible through native sources. Some of it was woven into romantic stories and songs, but most of it went into records, which, like the accumulation of earth and debris over ancient village sites, became buried in the musty stacks of old libraries considered to have no real substance in the emerging field of Darwinian doctrine. Quote, of the very early history of the region which now embraces Lake County, but little can be written. The Mound Builders had occupied it and passed away, leaving no written language, and but little even as tradition. These mounds were quite numerous, excavations having revealed the crumbling bones of a mighty race. Samuel Miller, who has resided in the county since 1835, is authority for the statement that one skeleton which he assisted in unearthing was a trifle more than 8 feet in length, the skull being correspondingly large, while many other skeletons measured at least 7 feet. Historical Encyclopedia of Illinois and History of Lake County. James Wofford of the Western Cherokee, who was born in Georgia in 1806, says that his grandmother, who must have been born about the middle of the last century, told him that she had heard from the old people that long before her time a party of giants had once come to visit the Cherokee. They were nearly twice as tall as common men, and had their eyes set slanting in their heads. They said that these giants lived far away in the direction in which the sun goes down. The Cherokee received them as friends, and they stayed some time and then returned to their home in the west. Collected by James Mooney. There were mounds situated in the eastern part of the village of Conneaut, and an extensive burying ground near the Presbyterian church, which appear to have had no connection with the burying places of the Indians. Among the human bones found in the mounds were some belonging to men of gigantic structure. Some of the skulls were of sufficient capacity to admit the head of the ordinary man, and jawbones that might have been fitted on over the face with equal facility. The other bones were proportionately large. The burying ground referred to contained about 4 acres, and with the exception of a slight angle in conformity with the natural contour of the ground, was in the form of an oblong square. It appeared to have been accurately surveyed into lots running from north to south, and exhibited all the order and propriety of arrangement deemed necessary to constitute Christian burial. Historical Collections of Ohio in 2 volumes. Although not regarded by the government as reliable, the oral traditions of the native people in the U.S. are of the existence of possibly 2 races of giants, one supplanting the other by violent means. Here we have the first inkling of some very remote prehistory preserved through the tradition of the Chippewa, Sandusky, and Tawa tribes, the existence of giant bearded men. Quote, in this connection, I would say that Mr. Jonathan Brooks, now living in town, stated to me that his father, Benjamin Brooks, who lived with the Indians 14 years and was well acquainted with their language and traditions, told him and others that it was a tradition of the Indians that the first tribe occupying this whole country was a black bearded race, very large in size, and subsequently a red bearded race or tribe came and killed or drove off all the black beards, as they called them, the Firelands pioneer. Many of these accounts have also been published in mainstream newspapers. Let's take a look at some examples. This one is from the New York Times, 1897. Maple Creek, Wisconsin. One of the 3 recently discovered mounds in this town had been opened. In it was found the skeleton of a man of gigantic size. The bones measured from head to foot over 9 feet and were in a fair state of preservation. The skull was as large as a half-bushel measure. Some finely tempered rods of copper and other relics were laying near the bones. The mound from which these relics were taken is 10 feet high and 30 feet long, and varies from 6 to 8 feet in width. The 2 mounds of lesser size will be excavated soon. Here is another in the New York Times, from Centerburg, Ohio, 1885. Licking County has been for years a favorite field for students of Indian history, there being here 2 old forts and scores of mounds. Last week, a small mound near Homer was opened by some schoolboys who found a skeleton. Today, a further search was made, and several feet below the surface of the earth, in a large vault with stone floor and bark covering, were found 4 huge skeletons, 3 being each over 7 feet in length, and the other 8. The skeletons lay with their feet to the east, on a bed of charcoal in which were numerous partially burned bones. About the neck of the largest skeleton were a lot of stone beads, evidently a necklace in life. The grave contained about 80 stone vessels and implements, the most striking being a curiously wrought pipe, the bowl having a series of carved figures upon it resting, a contest between animals and birds. It is said to have been the only engraved stone pipe ever found, a stone kettle holding about a gallon, in which was a residue of saline matter, bears evidence of much skill. Their bows, a number of arrows, stone hatchets, and a stone knife are among the implements. The knife is of a peculiar shape, with a curved blade and wooden handle. Students in Indian archaeology claim that it was the most valuable find ever made in that line. This New York Times article is from St. Paul, Minnesota, 1882. The bones of a giant found. A skull of heroic size and singular formation has been discovered among the relics of the Mound Builders in the Red River Valley. The mound was 60 feet in diameter and 12 feet high. Near the center were found the bones of about a dozen men and women, mixed in with the bones of various animals. The skull in question was the only perfect one, and near it were some abnormally large body bones. The man who bore it was evidently a giant. A thorough investigation of the mound and its contents will be made by the Historical Society. In 1904, the New York Times published this article from New York. While a gang of men in the employ of the New York and Harlem Railroad were taking sand from an immense mound near Purdy Station today to fill an excavation, they unearthed several skeletons of unusual size. The New York Times reported on this find from New Mexico in 1902. Giant skeletons found. Archaeologists to send expedition to explore graveyards in New Mexico where bodies were unearthed, owing to the discovery of the remains of a race of giants in Guadalupe, New Mexico. Antiquarians and archaeologists are preparing for an expedition to further explore that region. The article goes on to describe an ancient burial that has yielded skeletons of enormous size, including curious inscriptions and a frame of 12 feet in length, with a forearm that was 4 feet long, with teeth the size ranging from a hickory nut to that of the largest walnut. The chest of the being was reported as having a circumference of 7 feet, with an anticipation of thousands of more skeletons to be found. This supposition is based on the traditions handed down from the early Spanish invasion that have detailed knowledge of the existence of a race of giants that inhabited the plains of what is now eastern New Mexico. In 1883, the New York Times reported on a story from West Virginia. This time, a Professor Norris examined the remains from a mound located in Charleston, described as 50 feet high, which contained the skeleton of a noted chief at the bottom, measuring 7 feet in length and 19 inches across the shoulders, adorned with artifacts such as copper bracelets. In 1916, the New York Times reports on the find from a mound in Pennsylvania. The mound contained the bones of 68 men, with an average height of 7 feet, which were believed to have been buried 700 years ago. The article claims that many of the men were much taller, and some of the artifacts found included massive, oversized stone axes. Some of the remains were said to have been sent to the American Indian Museum, but I couldn't find any physical trace of them other than what is reported in the article. According to the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Telegraph and published by the New York Times in 1880, in 1796, according to the late Judge Atlee, he and several other judges witnessed the remains of 2 beings measuring about 11 feet in length, with bones that were entirely intact, but crumbled and fell to pieces soon after being exposed to the air. In 1912, the New York Times published an article about a find in southern Wisconsin. Strange skeletons found, indications that tribe hitherto unknown once lived in Wisconsin. This mound was at Lake Delavan, and when opened, yielded 18 skeletons with massive skulls, reported as much larger than any race living in North America, with sloping foreheads straight back directly above the eye socket, and nasal bones protruding far above the cheekbones. The jawbones were long and pointed, with female skeletons found as well, which had smaller heads, but with similar facial characteristics. The skeletons were embedded in charcoal and covered over with layers of baked clay. In 1871, the New York Times headline stated, "More big Indians found in Virginia." This time, a cave full of remains were uncovered while working on a railroad, described as a catacomb of skeletons of a remote age of a lost and forgotten race. The skulls were said to be nearly an inch in thickness. The bones were long, with the femur being the length of the entire leg of an average man, with an estimated height of 8 or 9 feet, with well-preserved teeth described as being as large as a horse's. The San Antonio Express reported on giant skulls recovered near a beach in 1939. This ancient giant skull, about twice the normal size, was found in Victoria County, Texas, believed to be possibly the largest in the United States, or even the world. There's an image of it on the right side, next to normal-sized skulls, which were also found. The newspaper article tells that the giant-sized skull was found in Texas, with confirmation from the University of Texas that a large skull was found in the mound in 1939, but that the skull has been missing from the collection for a long time. The San Diego Union reports in 1947 about traces of giants in the desert. A retired Ohio doctor has discovered relics of an ancient civilization whose men were 8 or 9 feet tall in the Colorado desert near the Arizona, Nevada, California line, with several well-preserved mummies found in caverns near several tunnels. The giants were reported as wearing garments consisting of jackets, trousers extending slightly below the knees, with a texture resembling gray dyed sheepskin, but likely taken from an animal unknown today. The Providence Evening Press reports in 1883 reports of what must have been Goliath. This time in Montana, reports of giant skeletons belonging to a prehistoric race protruding from the banks of a ravine, reported as being close to 12 feet in height, with a 12 to 15 inch head length, with a circumference of 40 inches, and thigh bones measuring 30 inches long. The foot was 18 inches long, and its great toe 3 inches long above the nail. An article from the 1893 edition of The Sun reports on the 8 or 9 feet tall skeletons of supposed mound builders. The mound was opened by the curator of the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, with giant remains reported as being between 8 and 9 feet in height. The mound itself was 12 feet tall and about 100 feet long, estimated as being 400 years old, and created by a prehistoric race that predated the modern American Indians. The torso and portions of the big skeleton were shipped to the Carnegie Museum, but that is the last anyone has heard of them. The St. Paul Globe reported on a giant in 1904. Bones of a giant human skeleton were dug up in Nevada at a depth of about 12 feet underground. Examined by Dr. Samuels, the man stood at nearly 11 feet, with portions of the hand and leg being of a very large proportion. In 1908, the New York Times reported on a find, this time in Mexico. A cave in Mexico gives up the bones of an ancient race. A cave containing some 200 skeletons of men, each above 8 feet in height, evidently a burial place of a race of giants who preceded the Aztecs. One of the skeletons stood at 8 foot 11 inches tall, with molars described as big enough to crack a coconut, and a head that measured 18 inches from front to back. Of course, there are many more examples, and these are not limited to North or even South America, as the New York Times reports in 1892 from Europe. In the year 1890, some human bones of enormous size, described as double the ordinary, were found in England and originally reported by the London Globe. The professor examining the find says the bones belong to a very tall race, abnormal in dimension, and opens the question of the giants of antiquity. Almost as mysterious as the finds themselves is what has happened to all of these remains since being discovered. While many articles claim that the skeletons were shipped to various museums, they cannot be accounted for and seem to have simply vanished sometime after the publications. One cannot simply dismiss them as fabrications or tribal legends, as many of the articles mentioned established doctors and well-known professors as the people measuring the physical skeletons and artifacts. The Smithsonian Institute, easily the world's largest museum complex, began from the generous gift of James Smithson, an English scientist who in 1829, when he passed away, bequeathed his fortune to nephew James Henry Hungerford, with the stipulation that if this man died without an heir, the remainder of the fortune would go to the United States. Hungerford died in 1835, and the Smithsonian officially began in 1846. Mr. Smithson's legacy to the American people was, in his own words, quote, "for the increase and diffusion of knowledge." Unfortunately, it seems that instead of diffusing knowledge, the organization seems to spend a great deal of effort into acquiring or confiscating and storing finds and concealing them, not making them available to the public. In 1882, after some 36 years of growth and accumulating ancient artifacts and remains, the Smithsonian created a Bureau of Ethnology, and a decision was made sometimes after to suppress information, despite the evidence of ancient races that predated the modern-day Native Americans. And this is not restricted to those of gigantic proportions, but include pre-Columbian civilizations reported to have reached the New World, such as the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Hebraic, Greek, Roman, Aryan, Celt, Scandinavian, or even Asian mariners. Evidence was either hidden or destroyed, and discussion of it was considered racially insensitive or supremacist, and not in alignment with the growing sentiment which was developed into the modern Afrocentric fairy tale demanding a strictly African hypothesized origin or supposed simian-based cradle of civilization, despite the fossil or genetic evidence against it. Needless to say, this was an extraordinary assumption, and one that has affected decision-making right until the present day, despite the reality that it has been debunked by many anthropologists, such as myself, that have graduated from accredited universities, yet are censored, deplatformed, suppressed, and outright banned from many mainstream platforms, even those in what are considered fringe or alternative. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. You can find my published books on Amazon. They make a great gift. Thank you very much to those who support me on Patreon. There should be a link below. Kindly share this video if you found it informative. Please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification bell for updates. I very much look forward to reading your thoughts in the comment section. Please have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon.